The weather is terrible. Christmas dinner is canceled.
My father called me at 9 in the morning on Christmas Eve, his voice carrying a practiced, apologetic tone, explaining that a serious ice storm had swept through the region overnight, that the roads were far too dangerous for anyone to travel, and that he'd made the difficult decision to cancel Christmas dinner entirely, for everyone this year. I spent that entire holiday alone in my apartment, genuinely disappointed but understanding, watching old movies and telling myself these things happen, that safety mattered more than tradition. It wasn't until 3 days later, driving past my parents' house on my way to return a borrowed ladder, that I saw my brother's car still parked in their driveway, Christmas lights still glowing warmly through their living room window, and realized with a sick sinking certainty that there had been no ice storm at all. Stick with me, because what I discovered that afternoon, and what I ultimately did about it, would expose a lie my family had been building for years, one that finally completely unraveled that following spring. My name is Unia Hargrove. I'm 30 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my place within my own family has felt subtly, persistently uncertain in ways I'd spent years trying to explain away as simple personality differences or ordinary sibling dynamics rather than anything more deliberate or calculated. My parents, Gareth and Marjorie Hargrove, raised my younger brother Elias and me in a comfortable suburban household roughly 40 minutes outside the city, a household that, from the outside, always appeared warm and close-knit, hosting elaborate holiday gatherings every year that extended family and neighbors genuinely admired and looked forward to attending. That specific Christmas Eve phone call, though, would eventually reveal itself as merely the most recent, most calculated example of a much longer pattern I'd never fully allowed myself to examine honestly, a pattern involving my sister-in-law, Noelle, and a gradually accumulating campaign to distance me from family gatherings without ever appearing, on the surface, to be doing anything of the sort. I remember standing in my parents' driveway that afternoon 3 days after Christmas, staring at Elias's car, at the warm lights glowing through the window, feeling a specific, disorienting kind of betrayal settle over me, one considerably different from ordinary hurt feelings, the recognition that my own father had constructed an entire elaborate fiction specifically to keep me away from my own family's holiday celebration while everyone else, apparently, had gathered together entirely as planned. Growing up, our household maintained an outward appearance of genuine warmth and togetherness that extended family, neighbors and family friends consistently admired, my parents hosting elaborate holiday gatherings, organizing memorable family vacations, and generally presenting the image of a close, functional family unit that I, throughout most of my childhood, genuinely believed reflected our actual internal dynamics rather than any carefully curated public presentation. Elias, 2 years younger than me, had always occupied a slightly different position within our family than I did, more naturally similar to my father in temperament and interests, sharing his enthusiasm for golf, for a particular brand of dry, understated humor, for spending weekend afternoons working together on various home improvement projects that had always felt, to my own more introspective, academically focused temperament, considerably less naturally accessible. I don't believe even now that my parents consciously set out to favor Elias throughout our childhood, understanding that family dynamics often develop gradually, through countless small moments and natural affinities rather than any single deliberate decision. But I recognize with considerable hindsight that this natural closeness between my father and Elias created a foundation that would eventually, once Elias married Noelle roughly 6 years ago, provide fertile ground for a considerably more deliberate, calculated pattern of exclusion that I only began fully recognizing throughout recent years. Noelle, from nearly the beginning of her relationship with Elias, displayed a particular kind of possessive protectiveness regarding her own position within our family, subtle behaviors I initially dismissed as simple nervousness or the ordinary adjustment period any new family member experiences, but that gradually revealed themselves over subsequent years as something considerably more calculated. A persistent, quiet campaign to position herself and Elias as our parents' primary favored children, gradually working to diminish my own presence and importance within family gatherings and decisions. I remember specific moments throughout those earlier years that, in isolation, seemed unremarkable but that, considered collectively, painted an increasingly troubling picture. Noelle consistently steering conversation away from topics related to my own life and career, subtle comments suggesting my presence at family gatherings created unspecified tension, Gradual shifts in how holiday hosting responsibilities were assigned that consistently positioned Elias and Noel's household as the natural center of family celebrations, while my own invitations to host or contribute meaningfully gradually diminished. Looking back now with considerably more clarity than I possessed throughout those years, I recognize several specific incidents that should have alerted me considerably earlier to the depth and deliberateness of what was actually happening within my own family, incidents I genuinely, persistently explained away rather than confronting directly. There was a specific Thanksgiving, roughly 3 years before that devastating Christmas Eve phone call, where I'd arrived at my parents' house to find the gathering considerably smaller and quieter than I'd anticipated, only to learn that an earlier, larger family gathering had apparently occurred the previous weekend, one I'd never been informed about or invited to, my mother explaining vaguely, when I finally asked directly, that it had been just a small spontaneous thing that hadn't seemed worth mentioning. My closest friend, Odalise Kern, had voiced genuine concern regarding this specific pattern on several occasions throughout recent years, gently suggesting that the accumulating incidents I'd shared with her over time painted a considerably more troubling picture than I seemed willing to fully acknowledge. "You keep describing these moments like they're isolated coincidences," she told me once, roughly a year before that final Christmas Eve call. "But Unia, I've been hearing about this pattern for years now. At what point do you start recognizing it as something considerably more deliberate?" I defended my family throughout most of these conversations, genuinely wanting to believe that whatever tension existed reflected simple personality differences or ordinary family complexity, rather than any genuinely calculated campaign of exclusion. It wasn't until that devastating Christmas Eve phone call, and the subsequent discovery of my brother's car sitting in my parents' driveway 3 days later, that I finally allowed myself to fully confront exactly how deliberately this specific pattern had apparently been constructed and maintained throughout recent years. That specific Christmas Eve morning began, from my own perspective, entirely ordinarily, my father calling with his familiar, warm voice carrying what sounded at the time like genuine concern regarding dangerous winter weather conditions. "Unia, sweetheart, I hate to tell you this, but there's a serious ice storm moving through the region. The roads are far too dangerous for anyone to travel safely. We're going to have to cancel dinner this year for everyone." "I'm so sorry, honey." I remember feeling genuine disappointment throughout that call, but also genuine understanding, my father's explanation carrying no apparent inconsistency or reason for suspicion, particularly given that our region did occasionally experience serious winter weather that reasonably warranted canceling travel plans. I checked local weather reports briefly that morning, noting some scattered light snow in the forecast, nothing that struck me at the time as inconsistent with my father's description of dangerous ice storm conditions, though I recognize now with hindsight that I likely should have investigated more thoroughly given how significant a claim my father was actually making. I spent that entire Christmas day alone in my apartment, genuinely trying to maintain some sense of holiday spirit despite my disappointment, cooking a modest meal for myself, watching familiar holiday movies, calling a few friends throughout the day who were spending the holiday with their own families. I remember specifically calling my mother that evening, wishing her a Merry Christmas despite the canceled gathering, and her response, warm but carrying a subtle quality I couldn't quite identify at the time, something I would only recognize considerably later as genuine discomfort regarding maintaining a fiction she knew, even during that call, to be entirely false. I didn't think much more about that specific holiday until 3 days later, driving through my parents' neighborhood on an unrelated errand, deciding on impulse to stop by and return a ladder I'd borrowed several weeks earlier, an errand that would ultimately reveal a betrayal considerably more significant and calculated than I could have possibly anticipated walking up that familiar front walkway. I remember the specific disorienting shock of recognizing Elias's distinctive blue sedan parked in my parents' driveway that afternoon, initially assuming, in a brief, hopeful moment of confusion, that he'd simply stopped by that same day for an unrelated visit, before noticing the accumulated details that made this explanation increasingly implausible. The Christmas decorations still fully displayed throughout the yard. String lights still glowing warmly through the living room windows. Despite the late afternoon daylight, a distinctly festive, lived-in quality to the entire scene that suggested considerably more than a brief, casual visit. I sat in my own car outside that house for several long minutes, processing a growing, sick certainty regarding what I was actually looking at, eventually gathering enough courage to walk up to the front door and ring the bell rather than simply driving away with my rapidly forming suspicions left unconfirmed. My mother answered the door, her expression shifting rapidly through several stages of surprise and unmistakably, genuine guilt as she processed my unexpected presence. Behind her through the open doorway I could see clear evidence of a recent, genuine family gathering. Wrapped gift boxes still scattered near the Christmas tree, dishes stacked in the kitchen suggesting a substantial holiday meal had been prepared and shared, Elias's young daughter's toys scattered throughout the living room floor. "Unia," my mother said, her voice carrying genuine discomfort. We weren't expecting you." "Clearly," I said, my own voice carrying a controlled calm that surprised even me given the genuine devastation building throughout my entire body as I processed exactly what I was witnessing. "Dad told me the roads were too dangerous for anyone to travel on Christmas. But it looks like everyone made it here just fine." My father emerged from the kitchen at that point, his own expression carrying visible, uncomfortable recognition regarding exactly what I'd apparently discovered. Any attempt at maintaining the original fiction now genuinely impossible given the overwhelming physical evidence surrounding us throughout that living room. "Unia, let me explain," he began, his voice carrying a placating quality that only intensified my own growing anger throughout that difficult confrontation. "It wasn't really about the weather. Noelle mentioned that she and Elias were hoping to have a smaller, more intimate Christmas this year, just close family, and we thought it would be easier for everyone if we simply said the roads were bad, rather than getting into a whole complicated conversation about it." I stood there genuinely stunned by both the specific admission and the casual dismissive manner in which my father described a decision that had required actively lying to me, constructing an elaborate fictional weather emergency specifically to keep me away from what he was now casually describing as simply wanting a smaller, more intimate gathering, a gathering that, notably, still included my brother's entire family, while excluding only me specifically. "So I'm not considered close family?" I asked, my voice carrying a controlled intensity that felt, in that moment, like the only alternative to complete emotional collapse given the devastating clarity finally settling over me regarding exactly how deliberately I'd apparently been excluded from my own family's holiday celebration. My mother attempted to intervene at this point, offering some version of reassurance that felt, given everything I was now directly witnessing, genuinely hollow and insufficient. "It's not that you're not close family, sweetheart. Noelle just feels like sometimes there's tension when everyone's together, and we thought it might be easier this year to just keep things simple." I recognized, throughout that entire painful conversation, that my parents had apparently chosen, quite deliberately, to prioritize Noelle's comfort and preferences over basic honesty with their own daughter, constructing an elaborate lie rather than simply having a direct, if difficult conversation regarding whatever specific concerns had apparently motivated this entire painful exclusion. I learned, through a difficult but genuinely clarifying conversation with my father over the following days, considerably more regarding exactly how this specific Christmas exclusion had developed, understanding that Noelle had apparently expressed growing discomfort regarding my presence at family gatherings for several years, discomfort my parents had increasingly accommodated rather than genuinely examining or addressing directly. My father explained, with visible discomfort throughout our conversation, that Noelle had apparently expressed feeling judged by me during various family interactions over the years, specific instances she'd apparently described to my parents that, once my father recounted them to me directly, struck me as genuinely minor, ordinary interactions I barely remembered clearly myself, certainly nothing that reasonably justified the escalating pattern of exclusion that had apparently developed in response. I spoke directly with Elias roughly a week after that devastating discovery, genuinely wanting to understand his own perspective and role throughout this entire painful situation. Elias, to his credit, expressed genuine discomfort regarding the specific Christmas Eve deception, acknowledging that he'd known about the plan to fabricate the weather excuse and had felt uneasy about it throughout the entire holiday, though he'd ultimately deferred to Noelle's strong preferences rather than genuinely advocating for including me honestly in whatever conversation needed to happen regarding family gathering dynamics. "I should have said something," Elias admitted during that difficult conversation. "I knew it wasn't right lying to you like that, but Noelle gets so anxious about family conflict, and it just felt easier to go along with the plan than to push back and create more tension." I recognized, throughout that conversation, that Elias's own conflict-avoidant tendencies had likely contributed significantly to allowing this pattern to develop and escalate over recent years, his genuine unwillingness to directly challenge Noel's preferences, creating space for an increasingly calculated pattern of exclusion that our parents had, apparently, found easier to accommodate than genuinely address. I made a deliberate decision, throughout the difficult weeks following that devastating discovery, not to simply accept my parents' vague apologies and quietly return to whatever diminished role within family gatherings this entire painful situation had apparently established for me, understanding clearly that doing so would only reinforce the exact pattern that had led to such a calculated, hurtful deception in the first place. I requested a direct, honest family conversation instead, one involving my parents, Elias, and Noel together, wanting to address the underlying situation transparently rather than allowing continued vague, indirect accommodation of whatever specific concerns Noel had apparently developed regarding my presence within family gatherings. That conversation, when it finally occurred roughly 3 weeks after the initial discovery, proved genuinely difficult but ultimately clarifying. Noel, when directly asked to articulate her specific concerns regarding my presence at family gatherings, struggled considerably to identify anything beyond vague, general discomfort, eventually acknowledging, with visible reluctance, that her concerns likely reflected her own general anxiety regarding extended family dynamics rather than any specific, legitimate grievance regarding my actual behavior or presence. "I think I've built this narrative in my head," Noel admitted during that difficult conversation, "where having you there felt like it complicated things, made me feel like I needed to compete for everyone's attention or approval. But hearing myself try to explain it directly, I realize I don't actually have a clear, specific reason. I think I just let my own insecurity turn into something that wasn't fair to you." This acknowledgement, while genuinely significant, didn't fully resolve the deeper hurt I continued processing regarding my parents' willingness to construct such an elaborate, deliberate deception rather than simply having this same honest conversation considerably earlier, before their accommodation of Noel's vague discomfort had escalated into actively lying to their own daughter regarding a fabricated weather emergency. The months following that difficult family conversation involved genuine, if gradual, rebuilding of trust throughout my family relationships, my parents making visible efforts toward more direct, honest communication regarding future gathering plans and decisions rather than continuing the pattern of vague accommodation and occasional deception that had apparently characterized recent years. My mother, in particular, made specific efforts to acknowledge directly the genuine harm their Christmas Eve deception had caused, offering, during a private conversation roughly 2 months after the initial incident, an apology that felt considerably more genuine and specific than her earlier, more deflective explanations. "I let myself believe the lie was kinder than the truth," she told me. "But watching you process the actual discovery, I understand now how much worse that deception made everything, how it damaged your trust in ways a difficult, honest conversation never would have." Noel and I began, gradually building a more genuine, direct relationship throughout that following year, one grounded in actual communication, rather than the accumulated, unexamined assumptions that had previously shaped our interactions. We had several honest conversations throughout that period regarding specific moments from earlier years that had apparently contributed to her growing discomfort, conversations that revealed, on both sides, genuine misunderstandings that honest, direct communication considerably earlier would likely have prevented from ever escalating into such a painful, calculated deception. Elias and I also grew closer throughout that period, his own recognition regarding how his conflict avoidance had contributed to allowing this pattern to develop, prompting genuine efforts toward more direct communication and advocacy within our broader family dynamics going forward, efforts I genuinely appreciated even as I recognized they represented change that had, unfortunately, required such a painful, calculated betrayal to finally motivate. The following Christmas, roughly a year after that devastating fabricated ice storm, our entire family gathered together honestly and completely, my parents hosting a gathering that included everyone, myself, Elias's family, and extended relatives, without any of the quiet exclusion or calculated deception that had characterized the previous year's devastating holiday. I remember standing in my parents' kitchen that Christmas morning, helping my mother prepare the meal alongside Noel, who had, over that preceding year, become someone I genuinely enjoyed spending time with once our relationship had finally been built on honest communication rather than unexamined assumption and accumulated resentment. We talked that morning about specific plans for the following year, discussing openly and directly how we wanted future gatherings to unfold, a conversation that felt, in its very ordinariness, like genuine evidence of how significantly our family dynamics had shifted throughout that difficult, ultimately clarifying year. I thought often, throughout that entire holiday, about the specific moment I'd sat in my car outside my parents' house, staring at Elias's parked vehicle, processing the devastating recognition that my own father had constructed an elaborate lie specifically to exclude me from my own family's celebration. That moment, however genuinely painful, had ultimately prompted exactly the kind of honest, difficult family reckoning that years of quiet accommodation and unexamined assumption had never once achieved throughout the preceding years of gradually accumulating exclusion. Standing in that warm, genuinely inclusive kitchen a year later, surrounded by a family finally communicating honestly rather than constructing convenient, hurtful fictions, I felt something considerably more valuable than simple vindication, genuine, hard-won confidence that demanding honesty, even when doing so required difficult, uncomfortable confrontation, ultimately produced considerably stronger, more authentic family relationships than the comfortable, convenient deceptions that had nearly permanently damaged mine.